Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Mark Tech being back. I apologize for this live stream having been delayed over and over again. I've had a lot of external noise in my apartment, so I've been trying to catch a good moment. This is apparently the best moment, but I apologize if you will get some kind of interference in the background, maybe some construction work or something like that. Let me know in the chat if everything is working. I can respond in the live chat. I have my iPad next to me. The stream doesn't seem to be activating there. I don't know yet why, but I hope, yeah, it's now working. Fantastic. So, today we are talking about not Apple, but something very much connected to my usual Apple-related topics, and that is the main competition, which is Samsung, and Samsung will be announcing on February the 2nd the successor to their widely popular Galaxy S series. In this case, we are getting the Galaxy S23. Fitting after the rebranding with the Galaxy S20, their model names now, the numbers reflect what we are getting with the years when the phones are launching. Now, it should be said that this isn't going to be the biggest year ever in terms of Samsung upgrades. I will say thank you to all the sources that you can see up here and all the people who have worked on those articles summarizing the rumors. This is primarily a rumor aggregation video and some statements from me on what I think this will mean in the grand scheme of things for the smartphone market and Samsung's biggest competitor, the biggest company in the world by most accounts, Apple. Okay, so let's get going. Now, we do have here on Android Authority a very short summary of what will be changing from the Galaxy S22 to the S23. So I apologize if I don't break down every hardware spec from the ground up. Something that I might do, for example, for an iPhone release, maybe for newcomers to my videos. So here you should have some basic understanding of what the Galaxy S22 was, but I will obviously still provide some details. Now, when we are talking about the design, it's very important to mention that we are getting sort of like no changes and some changes, but those changes are basically just trying to catch up to the phone that doesn't need any changes, at least according to Samsung this year. So the Galaxy S23, when we look here, the S23 Ultra with its separate camera module design, that one will be staying exactly the same, including this sort of like this curved sides here, while the S23 and S23 Plus, the successors to the S23, to the S22 and S22 Plus, they will also now be getting separate camera modules. So this is what you see here is the S22, and it will basically be getting the design that you see here on the S22 Ultra, which will stay identical in design when being upgraded to the S23 Ultra. So definitely more of an S year upgrade, and yeah, I know people don't like that terminology, right? They use that to make fun of Apple sometimes. Some will say, oh, but those phones are basically look perfect, why should they change in design? It's kind of a weird argument when Samsung even has like foldables in their lineup, and we could be expecting like even like slidable, rollable screens at some point. So the idea that flagships that stay the same design are excusable from one company but inexcusable coming from the other company, especially when it's very clear that the market is pretty accepting of either a small notch or the dynamic island cutout, or maybe slightly thicker bezels. Again, slightly thicker in this case literally means like half a millimeter or a millimeter at most more. So we aren't talking about the era of like the iPhone XR, which I am on the record on as being pretty much unacceptable in terms of bezel size, especially when you consider that that bezel is like continuing into to a big notch, while with all current phone designs, I don't care if they have like slightly asymmetrical bezels on top and bottom. I don't care if a bezel is maybe like 1/4 of a millimeter thinner or not, and I don't care if something has like a singular cutout or a dynamic island. So don't expect me here to either be negative towards Samsung for no design changes, or being positive because they apparently are so far ahead. I am on neither camp, neither an apologist for Apple having thicker bezels, but I am also not somebody who will attack them. And the same goes for Samsung and their design philosophies, the state of their current design, and especially with all the inflation that we have seen over the last 2 years, it's kind of everything that will go into keeping the prices as similar as possible. I'm kind of all for that for 2023. So nothing groundbreaking with the design, but nothing terrible either, right? Now, the next point is the most important part, and it won't matter that much for those of you, for example, in the US who already always got the latest Snapdragon phone, the latest Snapdragon processor. But this time around, the Galaxy S23 will be getting the Qualcomm Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 with all its connected parts, like the latest Wi-Fi and cellular modems, globally. This is a big change because several markets, including the market that I live in, Europe, Germany, has been dominated by Exynos. And I am also on the record for hating Exynos. Not just because I wanted to hit certain performance goals, but it always has some obvious downsides in my opinion. Sometimes it's dramatically hotter. Sometimes it consumes dramatically more energy. Sometimes it has way slower GPU performance. Often it has way slower CPU performance. And this year around, we are not just getting the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2, but we are getting the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 with a branding called for Galaxy. Now, this is still the same chip as all the other Android flagships will be getting. However, it's important to say that this chip will be slightly overclocked for the Galaxy S23 series. How that will affect battery life or thermal performance remains to be seen. Whether or not that it will need like an extra mode to turn that on is also interesting, right? So it's basically here, it's a customized Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 with higher clock speeds. Going back here, not trying to zoom out. So it has a clock speed of 3.36 gigahertz instead of 3.2. And I believe there were also rumors of it like changing GPU clock speeds. But yeah, I'm here always saying that minuscule changes in like clock speeds in devices that are incredibly thermally constrained, that will basically come down to the thermal architecture of the device. Like Samsung has been using some pretty good cooling over the last couple of generations, at least in like the S20 Ultra series, not as much in the lower end series and not as much on their foldables because those are so thin. So I've seen also some good benchmarks. So I believe it was like 1500 points in Geekbench. So we do have some Antutu here. Where is it? So yeah, this is here like the 3.3 gigahertz. So yeah, we do have like 1566 to 5179. The single core being noticeably still slower than on the iPhone, but the multi-core score getting super close. And honestly, when it comes to software optimization, I'm somebody who's always ready to like excuse 10, 15, sometimes even a 20% performance difference, because the rest will be handled by software and those kind of clock speeds will not be sustained anyway. So So I'm actually quite happy, especially because the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 will also be winning when it comes to GPU performance, probably over the A16, at least in some benchmarks. In games, it's usually still the iPhone winning, like always when we had like very similar results, we still had the iPhone slightly on top, at least until the iPhone became thermally constrained. So I'm not promising anything. I still think that we are getting some very good performance uplifts, and this is something that will be based on a 4 nanometer production, so it will be much better than what Samsung is currently offering with their Exynos designs and their Exynos fabs. However, that being like their own fabrications. However, that being said, we are supposed to be getting new Samsung chips in like 2 years again. So they do have their own internal smartphone engineering team, and they will be looking to create new processors again in about 2 years. To expect the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 this year in Samsung's, then the Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 next year, and maybe the year after that, or at least the year after that, that Samsung will be using their own processors again, at least in the markets where they were previously using Exynos. Whew, that was a long-winded response. So, what do we have else? The summaries. Sorry, guys. I have way too many tabs open. That comes from like over preparing, basically. Okay, so we are seeing some, and again, this is more when we are talking about like S-style generational upgrades, the camera upgrades. Right, the Galaxy S23 Ultra will be getting a 200 megapixel shooter, and the rest is staying the same. And the S23 and S23 Plus camera specs are also expected to stay the same. Whether or not we will be getting some small like sensor changes underneath remains to be seen. I usually don't pay too much attention to stuff like that, because we sometimes get like, oh, this is like a slightly better version of the same sensor, and then it performs exactly the same, or the changes are more dependent on the actual processor than they are the main camera sensor. So what is exciting here basically is the 200 megapixel shooter, and in that regard we do have rumors on, where is it? Yeah. So basically, this is supposed to be getting better details once again. Like Samsung's 108 megapixel cameras kind of don't reflect their high resolution. For one, they are pixel binned. Yes, but during that pixel binning process, you have a surprising loss of quality. So Samsung's 12 megapixel photos, which are basically 3 to 3 binned to their 108 megapixel sensor, usually end up looking worse and less sharp than Apple's 48 megapixel or Pixel's 50 megapixel sensor. So this is basically their HP2 sensor line. They're also saying that it has like better HDR technology. We haven't seen much in terms of like leaked results. I do expect a boost, and maybe it will even overtake the iPhone in some scenarios, maybe the Pixel 2. I do believe, by the way, that the Pixel has been kind of overrated over the last 2 years. Like the Pixel was like really on top of the game at like Pixel 4 and 5 and stuff, like when the other smartphone manufacturers were really struggling with computational performance, while I think nowadays Pixels just are iPhone quality is actually slightly worse, but a bluish tint instead of a yellowish one. And Samsung, which have actually done some pretty great work over the last 5 years in reducing saturation, are now back on their A game when it comes to oversaturating photos. So yeah, has actually been kind of disappointing to me. Like, yes, I understand that the HP2, like 200 megapixels, so it will basically go from like, instead of the 3x3 binning that we have seen previously now to 4x4, and it will be able to bin down to 50 megapixels or to 12 megapixels. Of course, it will still be able to offer like 8K video capturing, which has also been very disappointing. Like some reviewers like MaxTech, of course, their reviews were fair, and they did find that 4K recording on the iPhone still looked better than 8K on basically any other phone. But then some people were still mentioning that, oh, now it has 48 megapixels. Why doesn't it use like 8K? And because 8K requires a ton of computational performance that would eat into a lot of the compute that is needed to clean up the video quality on the tiny phone sensor. Even like, sure, if we are getting like full 1-inch sensors, basically, still, smartphone photography and videography is highly limited by the physical size of this camera assembly. So I am not happy with going suddenly to 200 megapixels. Like, why? What are you achieving with 200 megapixels that you weren't previously achieving with 108? And this, by the way, isn't like a sensor increase of like, well, it should be double in size, but let's say it would be like 30% in on each axis, right? That isn't the case, right? You can still make a larger sensor that has the same megapixel count, or you can also go all crazy, and which Samsung is advertising this as the smallest pixel on any camera sensor, which to me is like a mind-boggling thing to advertise, probably just so that they can make up other like stupid terms like tetra 2 pixel. Jesus. So I like, again, this is not trying to downplay Samsung. I've always said they are a good player in the smartphone photography market, but to only have basically one camera majorly improved, and those improvements basically also being like somewhat weird, right? Because even if you are going to say, okay, we are trying to get like maybe slightly more sharpness out of it, again, you don't need 200 megapixels as a baseline. But you also are now adding, again, more computational performance that is needed to work with that. So you will have more delay between like taking the photo and actually receiving it. You will have a higher discrepancy between what you see in the preview and what you actually get in the end, which has been like kind of the downside of Pixels a couple years prior. But by using custom ISPs, by using custom AI processing, Google has been getting better and better, and it's been always one of Apple's pride points that whatever you get in the preview is basically as close as possible to what you get afterwards. Over the years, that gap has become larger, but that's also because the amount of computation that is now being done to each photo has also increased disproportionately to even like the quality gains that we are seeing from that. At least the exception is like night mode. Night mode is like such a big improvement to what was possible like 5 or 10 years ago. Well, the overall camera quality in like good lighting conditions, I would argue, does not reflect jumping from like 12 megapixels to suddenly 200. So I'm not happy with how it's being like advertised, or how I expect it to be advertised, but I also still believe that it will be a good camera. What I'm not super happy to see is that the S23 and S23 Plus will basically keep their current camera arrangement. So good cameras, but just as on the iPhone 14 and 14 Plus, so the non-Pro series, definitely nothing groundbreaking. Then battery life is set to improve. Now that will also slightly depend on your market. I do believe that the S23 and S23 Plus will be better everywhere, because not only will they get like the more efficient chip, especially in markets that were previously depending on Exynos, but they are also seeing 200 milliampere hour upgrades. So from 3700 to 3900 and from 4500 to 4700. The S23 Ultra will keep the advertised 5000 milliampere hour capacity, though I have seen some expert cast a little doubt on those 5000 milliampere hours. It's usually like a teeny bit less with how the packaging works, so regardless, it's going to be pretty much the same capacity, right? So a light mode to manage thermals and battery life. Previously, it was very much needed for like devices like the Flip 4, which are much thinner, but also nothing that will change your phone. Like, it's basically a better battery saving mode. Satellite connectivity, similar to what we have seen with the iPhone 14. It remains to be seen where Samsung integrates it, in which markets, whether or not you get like with Apple, like 2 years of free usage, whether you have to start paying outright, or whether or not they will even offer that for like the life of the phone. But it's good to have it. So Android 13 with One UI 5.0, and I will have to say that I've read a couple of articles about like One UI 5.0, and it's a nice update, right? They have some improvements to basically a lot, like they now have a common family album. They have some changes that make it easier to integrate with their Expert Draw app. They have like better multitasking for Samsung DeX, some different settings, some different search across the system and also on the web. It's nothing groundbreaking, but it's nice. I've always said that like I'm a fan of One UI. I still prefer like what you would have previously called stock Android, but for given that the competition right now is like Xiaomi and to a degree like even like Huawei, but Huawei is like basically unviable in many markets nowadays. Like, I still prefer that over the skins of most Android OEMs. OnePlus, good that I'm seeing that here, is like the one exception, but now they're also like merging their user interface, so with the more Chinese stuff. This isn't a rant on Chinese software. I understand it wasn't primarily designed for the Western market and it has been getting better, but overall I would still say I'm happy with One UI and I'm glad it's improving, though I will say I have been very disappointed in their improvements to like finally smoothing out all animations, and I do hope that using the better processor and combining that with just new Android and One UI versions will finally fix that on like $1,200-$1,300 devices. Which brings us to something else, which is the price point. Now, the price point is an interesting discussion because it's very similar to what we are supposed to be getting with the iPhone, what we got with the iPhone, which is that it's the same dollar price. Why is it like, why are all my links now basically wrong? On the iPhone, we got a price increase on basically every other market but the US dollar, the US market. And so what's interesting about this is that this is supposed to be happening here too, but we're also supposed to be getting more storage in the S23 Ultra. So I will close down whatever I don't need anymore. So part of that is supposed to like, you are getting 128 gigabytes of base with S23 and S23 Plus, but you are not getting the latest storage. You are getting UFS 3.1 and not UFS 4.0. So while the S23 Ultra will start with 256 gigabytes, whether it means that it will be the one with the fastest storage by default, also remains to be seen, but I would kind of expect that, given that I expected like storage demand, storage speed, and also like storage overall will like go up with now a 200 megapixel camera. So yeah, okay, here we do have prices, right? Yes, it's expected that we are basically getting like the $800 for the S22, which now is the S23, and with how little is changing, it's kind of good that prices aren't going up, though we are talking about a 100 euro upcharge from previous generation in markets like Europe, because we are getting because we have seen so much currency instability outside the US dollar. So we will have the comparable like $1,200 for the S23 Ultra as we had with the S22 Ultra. So here, because of that, it's also important to consider the specification. So we now have 8 gigs of RAM on the base models, and 12 gigabytes being also, once again, only an option on the S23 Ultra. And that kind of, I'm somebody who firmly believes that you basically don't need much more than 8 gigabytes on a smartphone, because everything beyond that will likely eat into your battery life and keep basically apps in the background that you don't actually want to keep with full performance in the background. But this is now the smallest discrepancy actually in RAM capacity to the iPhone that we have seen in a decade. Because now the 14, 14 Plus and the Pros all have 6 gigabytes. The Pros have like the fastest possible, at least until we get LPDDR5X, which we might get from Samsung, whether this year or the next. And then we get 12 gigabytes on the S23 Ultra if you also get like I believe a higher storage version. So I'm sorry, I will just try to find, where did I have the pricing? It's kind of weird because I was so well prepared, guys. I have no idea why it doesn't work. So I will try to, it's the benchmark Galaxy S23 pricing. So I believe I have that article already open anyway. So yeah, they are saying here that the pricing are staying the same. However, we are seeing, for example, that prices in other markets are going up. So expect the same prices as before in the previous generation in US dollar, but here are the euro prices, which is yes, the S23 Ultra, you also see here, it starts once again, starts now with 256 gigabytes of storage, but it still starts with 8 gigs of RAM. And then you can upgrade to 12 gigabytes of RAM and 512 gigabytes of storage. Interestingly, here they also mentioned that the S23 Plus also starts with 256 gigabytes. So I believe now the base storage for the S23, so 128 is now only the base storage for the base S23, so not the Plus and not the Ultra, but also the only one that is getting 12 gigs of RAM is the S23 Ultra, not the Plus. Yeah, so that's interesting. Again, we're seeing even sharper increases in like markets like Denmark. So again, Europe isn't always Europe. When I say Europe, I usually mean like the Eurozone, where we use the euro currency. But across the board, price increases in everything basically outside the US. And that is kind of needed because Apple hasn't increased their prices in the US. So I think Samsung is very much seeing what they can get away with here. And I'm pretty sure that if Apple hadn't increased prices outside the US, then they certainly wouldn't be trying to charge you 1409 for the S23 Ultra base configuration. Now, that being said, that is still cheaper than the iPhone 14 Pro Max here, which I believe it's still cheaper than even the 128 gigabyte configuration. But that is very much pricing out a lot of people of making that like, oh, I will, instead of like the S23 Plus, maybe I will get like myself an Ultra. Like those 200 extra, yeah, that stuff suddenly starts mattering even to like better income people, in my opinion, because now you still have to consider how much inflation we have seen, how unstable like the job market is supposed to be over this coming year. So not trying to attack Samsung here, it's understandable given the fundamentals they are working with, but it's not something you usually want to see. But yes, finally I found an article with the prices. So yeah, this also interesting because I actually had that open here because there was an ad to pre-order the S23. Like we are getting the Galaxy Unpacked event. But what's very interesting about it is that you can already pre-order it, and then you will be getting like $100 discount, and whether or not that will be still offered once the devices are actually announced remains to be seen. It's rumored that you're also supposed to be getting like the higher storage version, or maybe again some Galaxy Buds as accessories. So let's see what we'll be actually getting. Now we are getting the announcement on February 1st, and then sometimes throughout February we will be basically seeing that phone. Yeah, so those are the most interesting specs. No, thank you here. I know that it's been a lot, and I've kind of been a little more disorganized than I usually am when I talk about Apple. Don't get me wrong, guys. I follow every relevant smartphone, tablet, laptop that is coming out. But because I'm more interested in Apple, not out of some kind of fanboy opinion, but that's simply what I consider buying. Because most of all, because I strongly prefer the software, I kind of have to say that like I can be a little slower when it comes to explaining stuff about Samsung. So this video was also very much needed because I will be reacting live to the Galaxy Unpacked event on February 1st, and I believe in some market it's like on February 2nd, depending on the time zone. But whenever it is, unless something comes in between, at which point I will notify you. That's when I will react to. So expect that basically as my next video. But as you have seen in my thumbnail, right? Now, this is the S22 series, but again, like the only thing that's changing is like the camera arrangement. Why am I speculating or making my viewers speculate on whether or not this will destroy the iPhone, whether it will doom Apple? Well, it's kind of a discussion that we have every year, right? So let's have it before the announcement and then have it a little more in detail once the announcement actually happens. In my opinion, Samsung will do something that is very much needed to give their devices a little boost in markets that were previously, like, there's a lot of like antiquated thinking from like Apple fanboys, I would say, that believe Android is still unstable, that scrolling is still not smooth. However, there are some good points still to that narrative, at least when it comes to Samsung devices in Exynos of powered markets. I hate Exynos. Like, for one, whenever I've used it, and the last Samsung phone that I have used more extensively is the S21 series. I've always had a secondary device, Android, basically to level out my Apple fanboyism, but also to play around with Android, and that was usually always a Samsung, the last one being a Galaxy S9 that I owned myself, but I did, for example, also have like an S20 that was for the longest time in my possession. So I'm not talking out of an uninformed opinion here. I did not own the Galaxy S22 series, I will say that outright, but I have heard from multiple fans that is from fans, I'm so sorry, friends. I do hope that my friends are partially my fans, but yeah, I've heard from my friends who bought the S22 series, because I do not just have friends that buy iPhones. This isn't some kind of exclusivity arrangement here. That battery life has been kind of poor on those Exynos S22 devices, and we have also seen like even some tests where like camera performance was not quite the same. Like you usually even got like a slight boost in camera quality on the Exynos Samsung devices, but then camera photo taking would usually also take a little longer, and then processing would take a little longer. Sometimes that could result in you not getting the shot you wanted to make. So it's been kind of a mess, and I don't think that in this day and age any manufacturer can get away with selling basically the same phone with a dramatically different processor, because of how that impacts battery life, thermals, even camera performance, overall fluidity of the device, even something as basic as scrolling. But obviously you do have gaming considerations nowadays, especially on flagship phones. You do have considerations when it comes to compatibility with some mods and stuff like that. Like you have a lot of, like, Android isn't a lockdown ecosystem, so you can download apps from outside Google Play, and those apps that can change a lot more of the system and maybe offer some functionality like emulation. Where I believe some people are now working on a Nintendo Switch emulator for Android. So that is kind of interesting, because having a big performance up and a big efficiency jump, and basically unifying the base for Samsung, like every device in the world performs very similar, so all reviews are similarly applicable. But then we also have, as a point of counter argument against that, we do have now the higher price outside the US. But in the US, the processor argument isn't as strong, because they were always powered by Snapdragon there. So, do I believe they will destroy the iPhone this year? No, but I do believe that if you are actually an Android or Samsung, especially enthusiast, then I think this will be one of the better years when it comes to making the argument that iPhones aren't smoother or more reliable, more stable. They usually still are, and mostly will be, but to such a small extent that you wouldn't want to lock down your ecosystem, maybe not have the extra zoom that you will have on Samsung. And there is so much that is still to be talked about, right? They do have like their ultra zoom capabilities here, and then they will also have like a regular, like more 3x zoom. So, and how all those cameras perform will remain to be seen. A lot of like zooming capabilities nowadays have more to do with software than they do have even with like the sensor that you're using, because you can use also the data from like the larger sensors. You can use data from like multiple sensors and aggregate it. That is exciting, and that's what the Pixel has actually been doing very successfully, which is why Pixel, in my opinion, has currently the best zoom camera. While the iPhone is actually pretty far apart, but the iPhone actually has the best 3x zoom camera. So it's been kind of a mess, and it remains to be seen. Now Samsung can basically even the playing field a little bit, offer all those different zoom capabilities in one device. But I do not believe that this will get anybody to switch, at least in the short term. I think if maybe like with the S24 we will get like maybe some bigger changes to the display, because look at like even like the spec points, right? Oh my god, I think I've closed down everything that I needed. S23 display. Yeah, sorry, this is German now. So this is interesting because they do now have right? Like that. Oh my god, no. Continue without disabling. Okay, so we do have still like 120 hertz across the board, and now we do have 1750 nits on the S23 versus which was already advertised as 1750 on the S23 plus, on the S22 plus and the S22 Ultra, which is interesting because that means that even in HDR we are not seeing an advertised boost, even though that's what we have gotten on the iPhone, which now basically reliably reaches almost 2000 nits in high brightness, and we have gotten some recent Xiaomi phones, and it was expected that like the newer generation of LTPO, which Samsung provides, so Samsung should have like the best one here. Yeah, it's kind of weird to not see that at least like bumped up to 2000, at least as advertised, right? Because Samsung usually is very aggressive in advertising hardware. So I think if they were capable of reaching 2000 nits, they would. But maybe they are more conservative than previously. Who knows? Maybe they are like reserving some like thermal performance. Basically they don't want to push it too high, so they still always have some thermal room left for the processor and the cellular modem and stuff like that. And then we also have like the telephoto lenses, right? Here we do have like 10 megapixel lenses, right? Both the periscope zoom and like the regular 3x zoom. So that's still kind of a little disappointing, right? For the value, I also think that like the S23 offering 128 gigs base, yes, of course, some will say like, oh, but that's what Apple even offers like in their higher end versions, right? Yes, but Samsung cannot quite get away with the same pricing structure as Apple, because even Apple cannot get away with their current pricing structure. The iPhone 14 and 14 Plus are selling very poorly, especially outside the US, where the price increase makes them very, very unattractive. Like, I'm not like, to my friends who like really are like saying, okay, I only have like 1000 to spend. Yeah, I'm probably not recommending the iPhone 14 series, like the non-pros, unless you can get them in a steep discount closer to like 800. But more likely, I will be either, if it has to be Apple, I would be recommending a refurbished device or just an older model. Or more likely, I would point them to even something like Xiaomi if they're very agnostic when it comes to their operating system preferences. So I'm not against supporting other companies here. The S Pen stylus is a neat thing in the S23 Ultra, even though it has absolutely destroyed the speaker quality. Like the speaker quality in the S22 Ultra, I would argue, is behind even like the S20 Ultra, and it's like 5 years behind what was on the S21 Ultra, which had amazing speakers in my opinion, which were very competitive with the iPhones of that generation. But now Apple has pulled ahead of even that, while Samsung will likely be staying behind in order to incorporate the S Pen stylus in what is essentially still the same body. So again, good devices, probably at the wrong prices for several markets still, even with the better processor improving the value proposition. I think very decent value proposition in the US where pricing is not going up, even though I always thought it was kind of questionable to have a Samsung flagship priced above Apple's similarly sized flagship, right? So they're like 6.8 inch device is like $1,200, while the iPhone 14 Pro Max with 6.7 inches is $1,100. And at the same storage configuration, they are the absolute same price, which is kind of weird when you usually consider that Apple is the one that is overcharging. And while you could say like, oh, but we do have like 2 gigs more RAM, the S Pen, and extra cameras and stuff like that. Yes, but does it actually change the user experience more than what Apple is putting into designing their own operating system, right? Their specific accessories like MagSafe. everything regarding like Apple Watch compatibility, AirPods, which Samsung does have a comparable response, but I always believe that Samsung phones are ahead of what they're offering, like in the earbuds market or in the smartwatch market. In fact, I think they've been kind of neglecting the smartwatch market. They've been sort of like aggressively advertising processors there, which I love because I think that Apple hasn't been doing that enough. But then they've also gone a step back and stopped updating everything else, which leads to like the Apple Watch Series 4 now looking more modern than the most modern Samsung smartwatch. So, but I know some of it will sound Apple fanboyish. This is not designed to downplay this generation, and I'm actually looking very much forward to the announcement. Maybe find out how they will pitch the ecosystem overall, how they will talk about like maybe something that doesn't come up on the spec sheet, but maybe they will be saying like, oh, brightness is like very much improved in direct sunlight. It can sustain like those 750 nits much better. There's also like discrepancies, right? We previously had 40 megapixel sensors on the Ultra, now it's 12. Whether it means that there's some kind of downgrade, I usually am not somebody who's like crying about like lower megapixel counts, but when you are actively downgrading that spec, then I usually expect some kind of acknowledgement about what is happening here. So, no, I do not believe that the S23 series will in any way destroy Apple more than the S22 series did. And the S22 series certainly didn't do that. In fact, I think that unless Apple goes all crazy and like increases prices on the iPhone 15 series by more than $100, at least on the pros, there's no pricing up movement on the regular 15 unless they're giving it promotion. Then I think that this is kind of a bad market for Samsung in the long term, because if people aren't gonna buy stuff now, if a recession starts maybe in a quarter or in two, but then the quarter starts subsiding when we get maybe closer to like the holidays directly, or maybe even in exactly a year from now when the S24 comes out, well then that will like depend on how good is the S24 series now, and expect me to make content on that as well. But like the fast charging, for example, is rumored to not be anywhere near to what is like offered on Xiaomi devices and like Oppo and OnePlus. And yes, Apple would still be probably like the slowest one, but Samsung has to compete in those spec points, especially in like markets like India and China, which are usually much more aggressive when it comes to like spec sheet purchasing. Like they care a little less about like they care more about the objective value of the hardware inside than the Western market, which usually prefers like, I wouldn't call it just branding, but like familiarity with the device that they want to buy, like how the experience with the brand basically is changing their perception of each device and their priorities across ecosystem stuff. Like here very much it matters like which operating system you have, while in a country like China, where a lot of functionality is managed through one app like WeChat, you can basically expect people to not care as much. So that was a very long one. I expected this video to be like a half an hour or less. Third Bank, do you think Apple can steal market share from Samsung at the budget price point like the iPhone SE? Who won? Very much a good question here, because do I believe they can capture the market share at the budget price point? My answer to that in this year is a categorical no, because we aren't getting a new SE device from the ground up. But look at the market share statistic, and I can actually do that for this year or the previous year nowadays, right? Apple has captured smartphone market share from Samsung, actually, but not on the low end, because Apple's consumers have actually been very, very happy with what Apple delivered, especially with the iPhone 14 Pro. And on the like lower end, people are happy buying like the iPhone 13 still across the board. Even like the iPhone 13 mini has seen a little bit of a rebound, but then again, we are talking about like a minuscule percentage of Apple's overall offering. So yes, smartphone market share worldwide, I believe this was just for the latest quarter, and Samsung is still winning for the overall year. I could be wrong. Those statistics are usually like wrong anyway. But you can see that Apple is doing much better than they used to do, and that is partially because the market has contracted around them, which results in Apple having a larger portion of the pie, because now their piece stays about the same size, but the pie is now smaller. Well, all the other brands have done much worse. And like even like here, people were expecting like Apple to be completely destroyed in the long term by the likes of Oppo, like saying like, okay, Apple will keep like their 13, 14, 15% market share, but they will do that only with their higher priced devices, while the lower priced devices will dominate the market like crazy. And we are seeing that this is simply not happening. Thus, Sabine, I hope I'm pronouncing it right. I hope I pronounced it right. You can finally see me live. Great. Let me guys know then later on Twitter if this is actually a good time for you. This is usually when I work, but I do have a month off right now, so I can stream around this time. Where's my webcam? I do in order to make this arrangement where I stream in 4K at 60 FPS. I do have my laptop connected to a big screen, basically an old TV that I have. And the problem with that arrangement is that I simply cannot put my iPhone here in a way. I don't own a professional camera, in a way where I can film myself while still looking into the camera as I scroll and zoom and react to the stuff that is happening. I'm trying to fix that, but it will probably not happen over the next month. Expect this arrangement to stay around the same for the next month. Then after that, I'm going on a little bit of a hiatus, and expect me to come back maybe with a solution to see my lovely face. So yeah, so this is basically kind of what I think about the S23, at least with the rumors that we are given. They always can be wrong, but the sources that we have seen here are usually very good. And there's so little changing that unless there's like one, maybe like crazy, like one more thing, right, for us Apple enthusiasts. Thank you to everyone who is live here. I've been trying to build a channel a little bit over the last 2-3 weeks. It's been a big pleasure to actually see a little bit of success, right? Over 1,200 views overall. I have like a video that will soon hit 600 views. I've had like more and more people actually watching live. Usually not much comments, because I assume that maybe people are like doing it while they have some household chores. Maybe half the views is my grandma that is subscribed to me as well and loves commenting sometimes. But I'm very happy. I hope that you can still like this kind of content even without my face. I know this kind of commentary and the end of the video will destroy the later views, but I really want to interact with the live chat. I hope everybody who interacts here also wants to interact on Twitter, because I'm usually pretty active there, and that usually means that you will also get much more detailed responses from me. Okay, no, like even if I go on webcam, there will not be feed stuff. So anybody who comes here, like at this point I'm not monetized, but even if you were to leave like a big tip, I'm not sending any feed stuff. I can make Sony content. In fact, I will be doing Sony content when I'm getting the PSVR 2, which is interesting because that is around the time when I plan to start my hiatus, but I still hope to have at least like 2 videos out on PSVR 2 by the end of the month. Will I be talking about how bad Xbox games are? No, I won't, because for one, I think that the problem with Xbox has always been a lack of games, not necessarily quality, and I've been very outspoken on how much I can like a game like Forza, while I can very much dislike a game like Halo. But for example, like something like Hi-Fi Rush is supposed to be pretty good. Pentiment was supposed to be pretty decent. Those are not the kinds of games that I play, and I see now people are tuning out as I'm starting to talk about it. So Dasubin, or you can let me know maybe on Twitter how I should pronounce your name, or maybe in the comments afterwards. So I will be talking about PlayStation. I will be talking about Sony in general. I will not be getting though the DualSense Edge, and that has more to do with like my own preferences. It's because I do have I got my PS5 digital with 2 DualSenses, and I did get like that little charging cradle for them, which basically resulted in like a perfect experience, right? As you can imagine, I can just switch back and forth between like the 2 controllers. The battery life is quite great, which isn't quite true for the DualSense Edge, and the pricing is kind of a little weird. Currently, the European market here, it's like 240 euros. So I will not be getting it right away. I will still be looking at like upcoming reviews. I've seen some decent stuff. I've also seen some not so great stuff. But for now, my next Sony related content will be focused on PSVR 2. However, I will be happy in the future, maybe even not necessarily as live streams, but I could react or maybe stream, depending on the video game, my reviews, right? I do play a little bit of games, a lot of Sony AAA exclusive, like those of you who follow me on Twitter know that like my favorite games like The Last of Us, and I'm probably gonna review the show when it's all over. Whether or not I will do it as like an essay on Twitter or whether I will do it as a video remains to be seen. Will depend on what I feel most comfortable with. But yeah, I will be doing Sony content, and I can actually promise that there will be quite a bit of Sony content in general, but still less than like Apple and like Apple's main competitors. But part of it is obviously that I would love, actually, like as a fan of the overall company, like Sony, I would have loved to see Sony like do more with their smartphones. But maybe if they like release an update, for example, like if they finally allow like game streaming on their phones, you can expect me certainly to react to that. And for game reviews, I'm happy to see you excited for that. I think the first review that I'm probably gonna do is going to be Horizon Call of the Mountain, which will also like lead into my PSVR 2 related content. But I will also be doing some I forget what it's called. Is it Burning Shores? The PlayStation, the expansion to Horizon Forbidden West, with Forbidden West being one of my favorite games last year. So I'm very happy to be doing that kind of stuff. Yeah, so expect me, and of course, later in the year, I would also react to something like Spider-Man 2. But I don't obviously have a full schedule for that. If my voice had worked last year, then you could have expected like TLU Part 1, right, the remake, to be my first gaming related video on the channel. But I made a video, then I wasn't happy with it, deleted it. That was the time before I did live streams. And what that resulted in was me getting sick a little soon afterwards and losing my voice for weeks and months. And am I gonna play Zelda Breath of the Wild 2? That is interesting because I think I would love to, but I don't currently have a Switch anymore. I gave my Switch to my younger niece. She has a better use for it. I'm still waiting for a Switch 2, but I was a big fan of. By the way, it's not Breath of the Wild 2, it's Tears of the Kingdom. But yeah, Zelda Breath of the Wild 1 was one of my favorite games of that year. Will I be playing Starfield? No. You were asking if I were to react to how bad Microsoft games are. Yes, Bethesda RPGs are like one of my most hated genre. Like I can play them like something like Skyrim and appreciate what has gone into it, even like the overall world, but they just don't appeal to me whatsoever. Like this is why during the Bethesda exhibition I was very outspoken about that I fully support that deal, and even taking all games away from PlayStation because it simply won't have any impact on me whatsoever. So yeah, my god, this video is now an hour long. So unless somebody has like some urgent questions anymore, and I basically destroyed the structure of the video, I think I might go more with those kind of streams as we are having now, where I can respond, because that's why I'm doing live streams basically. Like I don't want to be like a Twitch streamer who spends all his time in front of the camera. I don't actually expect like to ever make like even a dime with videos, but certainly not my livelihood. Like next year I'm confirming like my the end of my medical studies, so then I will be also much more busy. But I actually love interacting with you guys. That's why I've been on Twitter, despite how outspoken I have been about like my dislike for Elon Musk. So if you have more questions, hit me up on Twitter. Wait for my next live stream. The next live stream is going to be a less freeformed one right away. I will be reacting to like the Samsung presentation, but I will have either before that or afterwards, depending on my timing. Obviously some time reserved for my comments and for your questions. So don't fret, there will be a lot coming. There will also be more gaming stuff coming, but this will not turn into a gaming channel. That was basically my very long-winded response, and probably because everything I'm doing today is long-winded, like this overall video. However, I have to say, guys, I'm so happy with what I'm doing here. Yes, so great. So my top commenter is now leaving, which means it's perfect time to end this video. I'm probably not gonna add any timestamps because this video is a mess, but thank you all guys so much for watching, commenting, viewing live even, responding to me on Twitter, having suggestions. It's been quite a ride, and I think we are just at the start of it. This is Mark Tech, opening OBS, but primarily also ending the stream. See you guys during the Samsung presentation of the Galaxy S23 live. Have a nice day.